that we made. And in our next slide, we are looking at those specific examples. And I have some of them, those particular, the ones highlighted in red. And for example, we have the council, we assume that the council will be committed to engage in activities and self-improvement. So that's one of the key assumptions that was actually made in the beginning when the theory of change was being designed. And we also assume that the councils will be interested in forming partnerships. So we also need to assess to what extent have the council been interested in forming partnerships. And of course, we also assume that there will be buy-in support from relevant government ministries, the private sector's interest to engage with academia and research institutes. The council will be committed to sustaining partnership with each other. Policy and decision makers are responsive to research-based evidence. Researchers will have capacity to position their research for uptake, and so on and so on. So as we continue, we need to also have cognizance of the assumptions that we are making moving forward, because those also affect in terms of how we adapt and acquire the skills that we gain. So I know you've actually heard a lot from the CTAs themselves, and like I mentioned, my role is try to bring all that together. And I'll start by looking at the first thematic area, which is actually led by Sarima and AAU. They've talked about high quality calls of proposals, and during the interaction with some of the countries, also some of the literature review that we've been able to conduct so far, and Mozambique, Namibia, Kenya, and Uganda, and many others. We've just selected a few for the purpose of this particular presentation. I've already adopted the guideline to design calls for project proposals. Kenya, for example, has aligned calls with the big agenda the B4 agenda and the agenda 2063. In terms of research management, in Kenya, for example, they've learned a lot from NRF South Africa. And they're actually in the process of engaging a consultant to support them in designing a system, And not only from NRF South Africa, they've also learned a lot from the Uganda system. We've also seen in Uganda that they've revised their NTSIP guideline based on the international best practice in research management. And the guideline now reflects the international standards on research. And all this is actually based on the learning that has, the knowledge and the knowledge output that have actually been received from the council so far through the initiative. So some of the emerging points from the council on these particular thematic areas, based on what was shared by the councils themselves. On the research management, most of the councils feel like we need to have in place an integrated Africa system whereby each country will be able to learn from each other. And I remember we had this discussion in Addis as well on the possibility of having an integrated research management system. So it seems still with many of the councils, they would like to have that in place. And then in Kenya, and also I think in Uganda, there was a proposal that they need to train researchers on quality proposal writing, while the focus is to build the capacity of the councils to actually manage research in a quality manner. But of course, the quality of proposals coming through the same system that we've been put in place are also wanting. So there was also a request of extending the same training towards the researchers themselves to be able to write quality proposals. The issue of context, I think we've been discussing the issue of context, and it needs to be treated depending on the context for us to be able to maximize the impact. And then, of course, the last one, in Kenya, of course, there was something around the grant management whereby they learned a lot about them engaging with the institutions as opposed to individual researchers, which they found it to be easy in terms of managing grants. And this was actually a learning from NRF South Africa. On theme 2, which was not part of the had to co-fund risk institution, that was actually shared very strongly in Kenya. And maybe it cuts across other countries as well. Maybe that's something we need to have a chat on. And then, of course, there were issues to do, and I can't remember it coming out from from that particular end. But then there's an issue to do with the different laws and regulations when it comes to, these collaborative agreements. And one of the experience that was actually very dominant was that it actually slowed down the process of, setting up calls. And councils feel like they needed to be rigorous, or the political economy analysis needed to have touched on those policies and the regulations, so that actually it gives a good avenue of information on how to engage on collaboration, those bilateral collaboration moving forward. There's a need to build the capacity of research institutions on resource management that was specifically shared by Kenya, and maybe cast across also other countries. Also in Kenya, and maybe also this is an issue in other countries, the Public Finance Act does not consider the private sector. It prohibits public institutions in getting into agreements with the private sector without approval. And of course, the approval process takes long. Maybe this is an issue in Kenya, maybe it cuts across in another country. The culture of research institution processes are different from universities. Of course, I think we've been having that discussion now for a while on the different culture in terms of the bureaucracy and all that. Lastly, theme 4, the team that was here at this particular corner. 9 communication events have been held to date. I noticed in the presentation they did not mention this particular one. But then, of course, since I'm putting everything together, I also need to count this one, of course, and this is the evidence enough that actually this is happening. We've had annual forums in Cote d'Ivoire and Tanzania, regional meetings in Ghana and Ethiopia, workshops and annual forum in Livingstone. But then the key thing under this particular output is the extent to which the councils are actually using the knowledge and skills from this meeting in improving their system back in their countries. They also talked about the key knowledge output which have also been generated out of this particular session, which of course the next session will be looking, the next session by the University College London, that is the case team study, will be looking in terms of how the council are actually using these information or the knowledge products to improve their systems. Like I mentioned, my presentation is in 2 forms, and I've just given you a snapshot in terms of combining what you've been able to get from the various booths, and of course what we are currently doing in terms of consolidating everything together for us to be able to come up with the phase 2 overall report. But then the next slide will actually be looking at what exactly will be the role of the science granting councils when it comes to monitoring, evaluation, and learning. How do we improve our approach to M&E moving forward? So our roadmap to success, of course, I've mentioned about the 3 A's, the acquire, apply, and adapt. But key things that we need to embrace when it comes to M&E for the initiative is that we need to be able to document results. One thing that I've naturally noticed when I was actually engaging with the council so far is that the information in terms of what has been achieved is quite fragmented. We do not have that institutional memory in terms of what exactly has been achieved. So you find that, for example, we have one individual who's actually aware in terms of what has happened on gender, another one who was actually aware in terms of what has happened on private partnership, and then we need to have that institutional memory in terms of what has been achieved within the program from this particular initiative. And we feel like the role of the councils in terms of documenting what has been happening or what they've been able to acquire, adapt and apply will be very critical moving forward. We also need to have an M&A system whereby it also provides a platform for us to reflect and learn. I know we have opportunities through the annual forums and the regional meetings, but then we want to say that learning will have to be like a continuous process whereby when the councils themselves document what they've been able to achieve, they're able to learn from that and plan or re-strategize their work. And also when the council are able to document that, they're also able to learn from each other, cross-country learning as well. So the proposed approach moving forward is based on those three important aspects. And just looking at documentation. So, under phase one, what is currently happening is that the councils, they share their information, the CTAs, and then the CTAs compile all that and share the same to the IMT, or also document the same in the significant incident reports, which is actually online and hosted by Sarima. And then, of course, that information is put together and consolidated as a report. But then in phase two, we are saying we want to take a slightly different approach, whereby we want both the councils and the CTAs to document their success, their challenges, their learning, using the online significant incident reports. And that way then we have someone in the middle there who's able to analyze and check and verify with the CTAs and verify with the councils and advise on how to document, on what needs to be documented and how. And of course, it's based on the synthesized information from the male expert that the same information goes to the IMT. I mean, this also saves a lot of time for the IMT to focus more on highly strategic issues, moving forward. On reflection and learning, I think I've talked about it. That's the use of evidence emerging from the initiative to plan and maximize our impact, and of course to foster cross-country learning. And of course, I've also talked about that in terms of strategizing. We use that information emerging. When you document at the country level, use that information to be strategize your work and also to learn from others. Just to spend a few minutes to look at the current M&E structure within the phase one. So within phase one, we have the theory of change. We've been talking about the theory of change. Ellie presented the theory of change. I've also presented the theory of change again. And we also have an M&E framework. Also, Ellie mentioned about the indicators within the M&E framework. And we feel like that is not enough. We need to make it more participatory, whereby the two are not only owned by the IMT at that level, and of course, you only see your contribution differently. But then in phase two, we want to look at it whereby we need to have like an overarching theory of change, like what Ellie and myself presented. But then at the country level, we also need to have like context-specific nested theory of change that feeds into an overarching or broad theory of change. Then secondly, we also need to have, while we have an overall M&E framework that pulls all the countries together, we also need to have like country contextualized M&E frameworks that feeds into the overarching M&E framework for the initiative, with a specific indicator that needs to be monitored moving forward. And and to make sense of all that in terms of how that is going to operate, we also need to have a clear M&E strategy in terms of defining the roles of everyone on monitoring and and evaluation and learning, who's supposed to do what, and what are some of the things that needs to be put in place at the country level. So the strategy will actually help us to be properly coordinated, to be more participatory in our approach, to give the councils a voice in the M&E process, for them to be always aware in terms of what is happening within M&E. Good. So using the Slido, the link that I've shared with you, I hope you've been sharing questions as we move along. So I only have two basic questions to the council. The first question is what has actually really worked for you, if any, for the M&E process within the initiative? And of course, if you have one thing that you think hasn't worked very well for you, please give your recommendation, and of course, we can have a discussion on that. Are we putting in the questions? Already there. Do you mind?
So while they bring Slido up, for those of you who were here on Monday, Slido was used on Monday. If you would like to go back into that system, the code is D672, and then you'll see the questions, and you'll be able to post your comments or any answers to those questions. I'm hoping it's going to come up soon for those that... if you do not have Slido, if you don't want to use Slido, perhaps you would like to write down your comments and thoughts now, and then we can come back to those during the discussion.
Are there any comments so far? The council, some of you think that there's need to strengthen system of documenting change in SGCI. And we talked about having in place an online system that the councils will be able to access and document the same. Does the SGIs have a comprehensive strategy for engaging the private sector given the legal and other bottlenecks highlighted in the presentation? Now, I think that question is for Rebecca. Does the SGI have a comprehensive strategy for engaging the private sector given the legal and other bottlenecks highlighted in the presentation? One of the strategies that was developed by ACT under the private engagement, we have a strategy document. I don't know if it talks about that or it covers that. You want to talk about it?
So there is an engagement strategy that was developed at the beginning. It will need some revision. I mean, my suggestion is that if you have questions on it, that you talk to Morris during the break. Okay?
And then we have a question around what concrete action is the SGI taking to everyone taking to overcome the policy and frameworks misalignment that is hampering cross-border regional cooperation. Another thing that was not on M&A, I think that is broader, more programmatic. So I will not handle that. I think this is part of the discussion that we need to have moving forward. Does the SGCI have a comprehensive strategy for engaging the private sector? Oh no, I think we talked about that. Let's move on. Dorothy. There's so many lessons learning, but need to package this better. Of course, we have been having that discussion, of course, and we are going to package that so that we can, and the M&D strategy is going to be able to elaborate more on the M&D approach for the SGCI and the role of everyone. And that's why in the presentation, there is a part that we talk about the M&D strategy, and of course, which is going to guide everyone on M&D. I think M&D capacity building is needed at different scales. And yes, there have been efforts, and also the journey started way back also in Addis for those ones who attended the Addis meeting in terms of building the capacity of the councils on M&D. And of course, this was actually informed by a needs assessment that was actually conducted by AAU. And it's based on those particular needs that this particular capacity building has been taking place so far. And of course, the journey will still continue. The presentation perhaps can deliver much more if it's structured at the level of impact, at output, outcome, distinguished to M&E at council, CTS, etc. That's well noted. Does the SGCI have a comprehensive thinking? Why some countries do not be involved in the M&E? Why some countries are not involved in M&E? I think the idea is to have all councils from all the 15 countries to participate in the M&E. Because we are saying we want the approach to be more participatory. And the strategy will be able to pull and also to define the role of that. And of course, in the presentation, we talked about having nested country theory of change and having nested M&E frameworks, specifically for the initiative. I think I need to be clear. We're not talking about organization theory of change or organization M&E framework. We're talking about specific nested theory of change for the initiative and specific M&E framework for the initiative. So there's a comment on M&E activities heavily impact or rely on data collection. Does SGCI provide support to SGCs with funding? I'll look at Ellie on that, so I'll pass. And then why did NEPAD miss this meeting? Pass. So I think my minutes are over, and thank you for your and thank you for your participation as well. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a break now. If you have other comments or questions on the MEL framework, both what's happening now, what will be happening over the next couple of months, or ideas and suggestions for the future of the MEL framework as we move through phase 2, please see Donnelly in the break or at lunch. Please come back here in 25 minutes so we can be started by 11:15 for the next session. Thank you all very much. Please give yourselves a hand for this morning's activities.